Hello coders, welcome to episode 173 of the How to Code Well podcast. Today we're going to be talking about pre-production and what does that mean in the context of web development. But before we get into that, let's just dive into the changelog. These are things that have happened in the previous week in the How to Code Well space in the evenings and weekend. So we're on the second round of the coding quiz. Okay, so in the last episode, we talked about what the coding quiz is, and we had the first round there, which was the HTML, and there was a PHP question in that. And these quizzes go out to Instagram and Twitter every working day. And I also produced a roundup video of the first one, so HTML and PHP. And I've got a link in the show notes below there if you want to watch that. We'll do the same as well for this one. This one is JavaScript. This is a whole week of JavaScript questions. So if you're not following me on Instagram or Twitter, please do at How to Code Well to pick those up. These are going to be done in Twitter polls and Instagram stories. Okay, so I also mentioned last week that we had an issue with one of the Kubernetes asset paths in the ingress controller. That is now sorted. It was an issue to do with an nginx snippet around the proxy pass to an object store. That's now sorted. So that's sorted. So we can now move into pre-production kind of space, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Before we talk about that, I just want to give a shout out to PHP Minds. Thank you very much for publishing the YouTube video on my talk. I did a talk at PHP Minds in August, and the talk was code with confidence using PHP CS. Sorry, I completely had a brain fog there. Code with confidence using PHP CS. I'll put a link in the show notes below to that YouTube video if you are a PHP developer and want to learn PHP CS and how to gain confidence with your code base. Okay, so pre-production, what does this mean? Well, in the sense of, say, TV and film, pre-production means that any work before the full-scale production begins, right? So hiring actors and crew, finalizing scripts, and finding locations. And this is obviously slightly different in web development, right? Web development pre-production means anything before going live into production. And in my experience as a contractor, many clients that I've had have very different views of what this kind of means. Obviously, they all agree that the pre-production is stuff that is pre-production, but what is involved in that is actually quite different, depending on the client, depending on the industry, and depending on the project as well. That can mean different things. So in the broad sense, pre-production means anything before production, meaning that this goes from inception of the idea all the way to development, through to testing, through to deployment, build, and publishing, right? Or at that point of deployment. So if we were to talk about environments, the environments of pre-production, there's obviously your development environment. This is your environment that you're experimenting on and playing with. This could be on your laptop, desktop, whatever. And this won't be production code, right? Production ready code until it gets deployed somewhere to be tested. Now, obviously, it gets tested first on the development machine, but usually it gets deployed somewhere for perhaps a QA engineer to actually take a look at it and see and make sure that it integrates well with everything else, and it does the feature does the thing that the feature needs to do, right? And also to test that new feature with existing users, existing data, see if it works well with that kind of stuff. And now we're talking about what I would term as staging or testing, right? So this is an environment that isn't obviously public facing, which is a replication of the development environment, but in the sense of testing. So testing to make sure that it is acceptable to then go on to the next environment. Now, the testing environment also could have some tooling for testing, I guess, and auditing. So it could have things like performance testing suites. It could have obviously your acceptance testing. So it may have hooks into Cypress JavaScript testing library. It could have hooks into all sorts of different reporting tools to gain confidence of the code in sense of coverage, or in the sense of what hasn't been tested, what has been tested. Mess detection, all sorts of things could happen at this stage or at the stage between development and the staging environment. Sometimes what happens is, in some clients that I've worked with, what happens is that the auditing happens on a nightly basis, right? And then the devs get a report back in the morning. Sometimes it happens on the development machine, so the developer is responsible to run all of those bits and pieces. This is where it gets a bit muddy. It's very different for different clients and different ways of doing things. Once it's got to the point of staging or testing, depending on what the feature is, because it could go off to different types of environments for different types of testing, you see. So there could be a requirement that there's two systems that need to come together, right, to test an integration. And that could be in a different environment. It could be the fact that we're actually writing code for a new version of, say, PHP, and so it needs to go on an environment specifically with that PHP version on, right? So it's not the usual PHP version that every other developer is using. It's code for the next version of PHP or the next version of a framework or what have you, and so it needs to be tested in isolation outside of everything else. I've also worked in places where the staging environment is just a environment that people push to, right, and test. I've worked in places where the staging environment is actually lots of little environments that the developers spin up and spin down whenever they need to. I've also worked in places where there are development environments available and you have to select which environment that you want to use and choose and deploy your code to. So again, very different for different people and different projects. You also have things like beta environments. You have things like demo environments, shared environments, as I've just mentioned, and build environments. So usually, in my experience, the staging environment isn't actually client facing. So when I say client, what do I mean by that? I mean, say you're building a site for a client, for a large client. They obviously want to check the code, check the feature before it gets out to production. And what usually happens is that your web team creates an environment specifically for the client to look at. This, in my experience, isn't always staging. Staging is usually just for developers and just for testing. I mean, it could be called the testing environment, for instance, but for QA engineers and for developers to use. Once that's happy, it then goes off to a demo environment, an environment that is demo friendly for the client. Again, it's not public facing. The client has access to this, but they can see a demo of the feature that they've requested before it actually goes live. This is what I'm kind of classing as my pre-production environment. Again, it's very different for everyone. The pre-production environment, in my case, is the environment that is just before production. It is the environment that is production ready, right? But has the next version of the code base on it. And whilst the development of the next feature is happening, the pre-production is in sync with production in the sense of the features, right? So staging would be classed as my bleeding edge. So I'm committing code, I'm deploying it to staging as I develop. Pre-production will have whatever production has until I'm ready to do what's called a code cut, and then I'll deploy from the main line into production. I guess what I should do is actually talk about those stages. So I've got a section here on the notes. What does it mean for how to code well? So, okay, let's start from the beginning. I'm working on some code, and I'm working on it on my laptop, and I'm like, okay, that's great. I want to now push this somewhere. How do I get this from my laptop over to production? Right. So this is kind of a work in progress. This is I've got a Confluence document, which is kind of a live document because I haven't done this yet. I haven't built the pre-production environment yet. So this is up for grabs. This is up for change, but this is the loose plan. Okay. So the idea is that I will create a feature branch of the feature that I want to build. and that branch is taken from the main branch. Okay, so I'm working in the feature branch. I then want to do a merge request into the main branch. That kicks off a pipeline, and that pipeline builds the application, it tests the application, and it actually deploys the application to staging. So it's not an automatic process yet, but it will happen at some point. This will be continual delivery. The process actually takes about 20 odd minutes from testing all the way to deployment. So every 20 minutes, I guess, well, as soon as the feature is at a stage where I can actually push it to staging, it will automatically go up to staging. What happens is, when I say automatically goes up to staging, what does that mean? So what happens is that a Docker image is created, and that Docker image contains the code and everything that I've worked on. And then that Docker image gets deployed to the Kubernetes staging cluster, right? And then that goes off. So it like I said, it's not an automatic process. So I have to go into GitLab and actually press a button for that deployment to happen. But I will be making that automatic soon. So let's pretend it is. So I can write code in a feature branch and do a merge request into the main line. It gets tested, goes through a pipeline, and then gets automatically deployed into onto the staging Kubernetes cluster once that's merged. That's the plan, right? Okay, so how do I get it from staging to pre-production? This is kind of where we are at the moment. I obviously need to spend some time and actually build pre-production, which is a case of basically replicating the staging environment, but changing the way the data is handled. I'll talk about that in a second. So let's say that the sprint that I'm kind of hoping will be a 2-week sprint. Let's say the sprint is finished. And remember, I'm only doing the work on the evenings and weekends, right? So there's not going to be a huge amount of change. And there's not going to be a huge amount of features just coming out, right? So we might be building things that get deployed but don't actually get turned on. I'm kind of leaning on feature flags in that sort of sense. But anyway, we're moving away from the topic. So how do I get from staging to pre-production? So after the 2-week sprint, when I'm happy and staging is passing and built and fine, I'll obviously test it on the staging site manually, right? And at that point, you could go, well, you've already done your manual testing, so isn't that good just to go off to production? Well, the answer there is no, because staging has tools on it that shouldn't be on production. So for example, the Docker image still has a bunch of stuff in it for like caching packages and sources. It's also got things in composer land that is in the development dependencies, PHP unit, for example, PHP stan, my brain's gone numb, PHP stan and other things, the testing tooling that shouldn't be on production. Also, the way the composer has created the auto load is not optimized for production. There's other things as well. There's caching and other memory things as well. The Docker image needs to be slightly adjusted to be production ready. And then once that's happened, once I'm happy with that, I need to somehow think of a way to manually create a tag. So I will tag the mainline, and I will create a release branch. And this means that I have the tag and a branch just in case anything bad happens that I need to fix, any bugs that happen. I'll need to fix that against the release branch and then create a dot release as well after that. So there's like you can probably tell, there's a lot of things that I need to sort of pan out and sort. I've just created a very loose document of how I think this is all going to happen. I'm sure this will all change, but the idea is that at point of the stage, once the sprint is complete, I will then do a code cut. That means that I'm going to do a release branch and then a tag, right? I'm then going to deploy the Docker image that has the same tag as the name of the release branch. And again, tagging is a completely interesting topic, I guess. What is a tag? What does that mean? So anyway, the Docker image will be tagged. The Docker image will be pushed to the registry, and then it will be deployed to the pre-production environment. And then after that, I will do testing. I will do manual testing, and I'll make sure that that works perfectly fine. I'll probably end up at some point doing some automated testing as well against pre-production, but I'll do it from here's a testing environment, here's a pre-production environment, hitting that environment, So Cypress is living on one server, and pre-production, which is production ready, is living in that server, and I'm just hammering pre-production and seeing what falls out. But hopefully, if I've tested it well in staging, then hardly anything. The idea is that pre-production is just the green light. It's like, yeah, everything's fine. It is as it should be. And then once I'm happy with that, I'll then deploy it to production, and I'll deploy that tag to production. As I said, if there's any bugs or anything during pre-production, then I would have to create a dot release. So I suppose what we could do is talk about tagging a little bit, because this is something that's very different for different clients. Different people have different ways of tagging. So, you got the semver stuff, which is like major, minor patch. You've got things like if you're doing monthly releases or daily releases, you may have the day number or the week number or the month number or what have you, or the year within your thing. I want to try and move away from those boundaries. And they work well for certain clients, right? They work well for certain things that have a strict, rigorous release cycle. However, because it's just me doing this, and this is factored in quite a lot with this because it's just me, so I don't want to overcomplicate it. Otherwise, it's just never going to happen. And I don't want to make it oversimplified because then all sorts of problems will happen in the future. So it's kind of finding that balance. So with tagging, what I'm planning to do is just increment the number. I mean, it sounds perfect, really. I'm just going from version 1 to version 2, version 3, version 4. And then that means that I'm not bound to any particular kind of month or week or day or what have you. So that's not included in the version number. And the point release, if there was a bug, it would be like version 1.1, version 1.2, version 1.3. There won't be any meaning to the actual version number in the sense of, oh, this is a major breaking change. It will just be this version is greater than that version because this version happened after that version. There's going to be no cleverness, no intelligence. I won't be able to look at this thing and go, oh yeah, that was a breaking change. Because when you're packaging a website, a web application, there is so much involved with all the components. So it's like, how do you know if it's a breaking change? Surely everything's a breaking change, or maybe not. So yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing. I've just decided to go as simple as possible. So that's how I'm planning to do it. So the next stage is to build this pre-production environment. It's going to take me a while, because a lot of the scripts that I've created are specifically to staging environments. So just the word staging needs to be removed out of these scripts and then injected in as a different environment and so forth. I need to obviously build pre-production locally to see that I can actually get that site to run. And then I need to create, update the registry with the pre-production credentials. I need to do all sorts of DNS-y type funky things, and TSL and all of that jazz to domain stuff with that, secure it, and actually think about what is production ready. What does that mean? So I might do a video on what that means when I know what that means in terms of how to code well. But anyway, if you haven't done so already, please do subscribe to YouTube. So youtube.com/how to code well. You'll be able to see these podcasts as well as the courses and tutorials that I do. Also do check out the Twitters and Instagram. So that's at How to Code Well on both of those for the coding quizzes. Like I said, this is all JavaScript this week. So I'm not sure what's going to happen next week. We might do some PHP, or we might do some CSS. I haven't just quite decided yet. So anyway, thank you ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone. And I'll see you again next time. Cheers. Bye-bye.